Concern for justice. When we are falsely accused or abused, we should pray for justice, but our goal should always be to uphold God's righteousness. Here now is Dr. Gene Getz.
When you look at the caption in your Life Essential Study Bible, a caption that's over this psalm, you see that this is entitled and it's a rather obtuse word. It's called a shigayon, which really is a word that is used to describe a poem, but it's a particular kind of poem. And it's a song. It's a song that David sang to the Lord. But this kind of poem is a psalm that has very strong mental and emotional feelings. And you're going to see those come through when you read this particular psalm. Now you'll notice it also says that this was a song to the Lord by David concerning the words of Cush. We don't know who Cush was or is, but we do know that he was a Benjamite. And this gives us an interesting clue in relationship to what David actually prays in this psalm. Because you see, Saul was a Benjamite, the first king of Israel. And Saul became, really, because of jealousy, one of David's enemies. He was out to get him, to take his life. On several occasions, he was actually coming in on David, and yet God delivered David as the future king of Israel. So we know that following Saul, and after Saul's death on Mount Gilboa, there was about 8 years before David became the king of Israel, over all of Israel. Initially, he was king over Judah, but then he became king over the northern tribes as well. But during that period of time, that approximately 8-year period of time, there were many attempts by several of Saul's relatives, or at least Benjamites, who literally tried to take David's life. So that's the context that we have here for David's prayer for justice. So, beginning in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 7, notice what we read. I've called this David's prayer. Very specific prayer. Yahweh, my God, I seek refuge in you. Save me from all my pursuers and rescue me, or they will tear me like a lion. They will ripping me apart with no one to rescue me. Now, that reflects some deep pain and some incredible worry and fear on David's part. Incidentally, when you go back in the Psalms, when you look at Psalm 1 and 2, these were just psalms generally that were written by other people. But when you begin to get into Psalm 3, you see it's a psalm of David. And David progressively wrote these psalms. Psalm 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. But as you look at these psalms, you see a progression in terms of the fear and anxiety that David was feeling. And here you see tremendous fear and anxiety. It reaches a new level of fear and intensity when he prays for deliverance, when he prays for God to deliver him, and uses this metaphor of a lion just ripping him to pieces. So there's a lot of fear here. And the interesting thing is that David defends himself, his self-defense, in verse 8. The Lord judges the people. Vindicate me, Lord, according to my righteousness and my integrity. Now, to understand that, simply, we need to understand the context of that once again. And you can imagine when Saul tried to take David's life. And then David had a chance on several occasions to take Saul's life, to put a spear right through him in a cave. And Saul wouldn't have known what hit him. Another time he was asleep in a camp. But what did David say? I cannot lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. In essence, what he is saying here is, basically, I've tried to live a righteous life and be a man of integrity and not lifting my hand against the Lord's anointed. So when he talks about his righteousness, his integrity, he is simply saying, I have tried to live my life in relationship even to my enemies in a way that would please God. So he looks to God, he reminds God of what he has attempted to do, but ultimately he comes to verse 17, and most importantly, we see his gratefulness. And he sees that the measuring stick for his behavior is God's righteousness. Notice what he says, I will thank the Lord for his righteousness. That was really the motivation in David's life when he made those decisions. It was God's righteousness. It was God's will. It was God's way. And consequently, he said, I will sing about the name of Yahweh, the Most High. I will praise him. So let me repeat that principle so you see the connection to David's experience, because this principle really emerges from his life and is, of course, verified throughout the rest of the Bible. When we are falsely accused or abused, we should pray for justice, but our goal should always be to uphold God's righteousness. And that's what David is attempting to do. Now, when we get to the New Testament, Jesus takes this whole concept to even a much higher level. And let me just share what Jesus said about our enemies. In Matthew chapter 5, Sermon on the Mount, beginning in verse 43, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, and here's the much higher level, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, one of the great tests in my life in relationship to that, and I haven't had many tests to love my enemies, but I had a test. And that test came a number of years ago when an arsonist came into our offices at our church and entered my office, set fire to my furniture in my office, beginning with the couch. We reconstructed all of this, and then went throughout the rest of all the offices and took out over 50 offices, destroyed. At that time, we had 17 full-time pastors, and most of us lost our libraries completely. There was nothing left in my office. And I got this call 2 or 3 in the morning on a Monday morning to come to the office, looked up, and there was our whole office complex on fire. And by then, there were helicopters overhead, a mic in front of me from one of the channels saying, we're with Pastor Gene Getz, there's a fire. Pastor Getz, what do you say at a time like this? And all I remember is I could quote Romans 8:28 at that particular time. But I was faced with a tremendous challenge. That was on a Monday. By Wednesday, the word was out. We knew it was an arsonist. We had a meeting in our church building with all the people that were there. And can you imagine the anger that I had to deal with towards someone, and we knew it was an arsonist by that time, who had taken out all our offices? Well, the fact is, I had to deal with my anger first before I could lead the people to have this attitude that Jesus says right here. And I remember quoting this verse. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. And notice what Paul said. Paul affirms this. Friends, do not avenge yourselves. Instead, leave room for his wrath, for it is written, vengeance belongs to me. I will repay, says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For in so doing, you will be heaping fiery coals on his head. Do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good. And that was a tremendous challenge, experientially, for me and for all of our people. Now, the fact is, we still prayed for justice. I remember the fire marshal was there. Fortunately, he was a Christian, stood by my side, and we prayed for justice. The fact of the matter is that we knew who the man was, but they were never able to bring him in because they didn't have enough evidence to bring him before the grand jury. You see, arsonists destroy all the evidence. And that's true of a lot of arsonists. But to this day, periodically, if this man is still living, I pray for him that he will bow his knee at the foot of Jesus Christ. And that was a tremendous experience. But the fact of the matter is, we can and should pray for justice. That is not outside the will of God. But we're not to take vengeance. And that's what Paul meant in Romans 13:4 when he said, for government is God's servant. Now, understand when he said government is God's servant, that's not the kind of servanthood he's talking about when he washed the disciples' feet and said, you're to be servants of one another. Here, basically, Paul is simply saying that God has established governments to be a servant to mankind. For government is God's servant for your good, but if you do wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry the sword for no reason. For government is God's servant, in that sense, an avenger that brings wrath on the one who does wrong. Now, I think that is a very powerful statement in relationship that we need to recognize government, and we should do everything we possibly can to live within a governmental system without violating the will of God. And we need to pray for justice. But that raises a question. What should a Christian do for self-protection when lawlessness seems to be out of control? And we have situations today where people are actually fleeing their countries so they're not killed. And some of them because of their faith. And that's not wrong. But there are some, in some situations, who literally give their lives because they have nowhere to go except to heaven. Interestingly, if you want a good study, read Bonhoeffer. There's another interesting illustration. Dietrich Bonhoeffer lived as a pastor during the time of Nazi Germany. And he was really a pacifist. But if you read that story, you'll know that the Nazis and Hitler infiltrated the churches and began to even turn the pastors away from the truth to support the horrible crimes and atrocities. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer actually came to the United States. They said, flee, go. But he got over here and he said, no, I've got to go back. And when he went back to do what he could, he made a decision that was totally opposite of his perspective. And that is to become a part of a group that would try to take Hitler out. And he came to that conclusion because of what he saw Hitler and the Nazis doing in killing millions of Jews, not just the Jews, but people who were challenged, people who had mental issues, experiments, destroying people. And he literally made a decision to join a group of people to try to stop Hitler, even if it meant taking him out. It's an interesting story because he really struggled with that decision. And I would recommend that you read that story. The irony is that the war was over, Hitler was dead, and still Bonhoeffer was killed, his life was taken because he became a part of that conspiracy. They were not able to stop the death sentence prior to his death. The fact of the matter is, there is a principle here that we need to think about that emerges from the whole biblical story, and let me just repeat that principle for you. When we're falsely accused or abused, we should pray for justice. But our goal should always be to uphold God's righteousness.